Lava for Good's The War on Drugs podcast exposes what they describe as the absurdity of the real-world consequences of 50 years of our failed war on drugs. There are co-hosts here, comedian Clayton English and Greg Glod, Senior Criminal Justice Fellow at Americans for Prosperity. These guys examine the cost of 5 decades of the policies that we have embraced, the policing that's been done, the persecution of people that, in their view, and one in which I share, are sick. These two really cover a diverse subject matter. They peel back the surface of this complicated period in our history and talk about how the war on drugs has really fueled over-incarceration, has actually exacerbated addiction and come at a very high cost economically. So, Greg, Clayton, welcome to the podcast. You said it in one sentence pretty well. It's a war on people, not a war on drugs. What needs to change? If we're not going to do what we're doing, and clearly what we're doing is not working. Everybody wants to point to the pandemic now because it was a major event, but this was a problem way before the pandemic. We go back to prohibition and all this kind of thing. We're not going to arrest our way out of this. So what should be happening right now? What should we be doing?
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot from a public policy standpoint to try to kind of right some of the wrongs from the laws that are on the books and the things that we're able to do. Our team works a lot on Capitol Hill and in states to, right now we're working on a bill called the Equal Act, which would, stop the crazy chasm between how we treat crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine, which are essentially pharmacologically, identical, except for crack, the way that you bake it. Allows it to be a much more pungent punch, cheaper, and shorter lived. And so that was essentially established after, in the 80s, kind of seeing the crack cocaine epidemic. And this is the way that we thought we were going to get out of it. It was a failure. And so to make that a one-to-one and start right-sizing some of those laws, reduce some of the mandatory minimums, allow for judges to see a case and say, the mandatory minimum says you're supposed to go to 10 years, but I think that you would be much better in recovering addiction. So you're going to go to jail for 2. There's all these things that we can kind of start picking at the edges around, limit the ways that law enforcement's able to, do no-knock warrants based upon, a minor drug bust and things like that. There's a lot of those civil liberty aspects of things. But when you're talking about actually winning this drug war overall from a policy standpoint, it is start to take a healthcare approach rather than a criminal justice approach, to allow for experts to lead on this and get people into recovery, through methods that we know work. And so, one thing I do somewhat agree with, but I don't like the way that it's been implemented in practice. It is kind of some of the, medically assisted treatments that we see, that have been effective in places like Europe and Switzerland, where you allow people to come in and utilize, drugs and wean them off in a certain way. But I think that we failed at that as a public policy standpoint, kind of going the other way, and have allowed for open air drug markets to proliferate in places like San Francisco and Philadelphia and Baltimore. And I don't think that's the right way either. We need to find that balance between, actual tough love, and allowing for this and understanding that aspects. But we kind of go one way or the other. We either try to criminalize our way out of it or essentially ignore the problem. And it really is that tough love standpoint where we have carrots, we have sticks. You can't just, you have to earn your way off of this, but also lead you through a place of empathy and understanding that failure is a part of recovery. That's the one part. You see a lot of things that we try to do from diversion, but the first time they have a dirty urine test, or the first time they miss a meeting, we throw them out on their ass, or we throw them in prison. And these are the types of things that fail and what bring people back to relapse. So it's complicated, it's messy. But having that tough love aspect and trying to lead with policy and evidence rather than kind of feel, that's where we need to start at the very least.
Clayton, what do you think people need to hear that are on drugs that's going to get them to be drawn towards some kind of help instead of hide from people that are out there trying to help? What do you think people need to hear that are on the drugs?
Man, that's a tough one. But I think they need to know that it's people that actually care about them, and there's people out there that want to see them a functioning member of society. So I don't really know where to begin. I think like even I have people in my family, like you don't know, you want them to get the help. It's like you said, you bring them into your house and they could be good for max maybe 2 weeks before stuff starts turning up missing, and everybody's gonna turn on them, and that's why they're out on the street. That's why they're cast out. But I think that there's people out there that, want to see them do well. But from what I hear, they got to hit that bottom. They gotta hit rock bottom before they even start seeking help, or they got to get to such a low point that, it's sad that that's the way it is, but that's what I hear. So I think the best thing people can do that aren't on drugs is be there and help guide these people when they're trying to come back into society, and not just look at them like they're the lowest piece of trash.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's trying to show that they have value and that they can provide something, and actually showing that in action. This always sticks out to me when I visited a prison. There was a guy that was in and out of it. It was either a string of robberies or larceny, but a lot of it was drugs to kind of keep that habit going. And he finally got enrolled in a class while he was in prison, and he said something, and the instructor, he said like, "Oh, you're really smart." And he's like, "That's the first time I've ever heard anyone say that." And he had been like a model inmate since then. I think he's released at this point, unless something else had happened. But I do think it is that value aspect that people don't see their value once they get into this process, and they're living day in and day out just trying to keep this fix. And so can we provide you with some value, either through family reunification, through maintaining and earning, living accommodations, either through work or treatment and things like that. I think earning those types of things, not only does it kind of bring you out and give you that incentive to stay within this better environment, but it brings pride to you. It brings something like there's nothing more prideful than doing well at your job, being able to buy a house or buy that new car, and like striving for those goals and earning them. You see it all the time with like people that win the lottery. They get millions and millions of dollars, and then they're bankrupt and on their ass like later because they didn't earn it. They didn't actually do that blood, sweat, and tears. Like Clayton, how amazing was it to probably open for Chappelle or win last time? Said when you had done all those hours before, going into shitty comedy clubs across the country, doing opening acts, all that open mic stuff, like to finally like hit that point and peak. That's what matters. Like that. And then you're like, okay, like I've made it. Like, and that means so much more than like, here's your award, or you're playing the Forum tonight, you didn't earn your shit. Like it's a bigger diff. Yeah.
And with you saying that, I think the thing that I would tell people that are addicted is kind of learning from Dr. Phil just now while we've been sitting here is figure out what you want to do. Figure out what you want to do, where you want to be. And it's so many people who have came from addiction that have gone on to be some of the most prolific writers, actors, musicians. All types of beautiful art has been created from people who, if we just looked at them in one point of their life, would be viewed as an addict. So yeah, find something. Because comedy was definitely that for me.
Just like any war, to be effective, you have to essentially turn your population through propaganda against this enemy. And that's what we've done, just vilify this population and made them seem like they're lesser than. And that's been by practice. That's not, that's not a flaw in the system. That's been by design, so that they're able to increase sentences. So you can do all these things with civil asset forfeiture, where you take people's stuff without convicting them of a crime, where you're able to utilize a no-knock warrant, essentially deprive people of these liberties because of this war, because drug addicts are bad and they're villains. They are the enemy of this war. And we have done that over and over again, rather than saying this is a problem, this is some behavior that we don't want in our society. But the way we get out of this is love, empathy, and value in these people around the other way, just like anything else. I mean, think about, beating your kids, spanking your, doing all these things to children, we would not accept. Like, it's not that hard. It's not rocket science to understand. It's not anything different than what you're saying, just how you do parenting or being a teacher, or anything else, just teaching people how to be people and providing value in their lives. That's what we're supposed to do as a society. And we have utterly failed this, population.
I said some of this when we've talked before, but I really worry sometimes about the government, and in this situation, prosecutors who do become abusive. I mean that at several different levels, but as I've said before, I think they forget what their job is, and their job is to seek justice, not a conviction. I think sometimes they get into a case and they get involved ego-wise and time-wise and career-wise. They get bought in and they go after a conviction as opposed to a just conviction. So they'll do virtually anything to get that conviction once they start down that path, whether it's just or not. And I can't believe that some of these prosecutors don't know when they've gone past the line and say, I've taken liberties here in getting a confession. I've taken liberties here in getting someone to say something that a reasonable, rational interrogation in the bright light of day with proper support in place would never have been given. Is that a fair statement, or am I being too critical?
I think you're spot on. I mean, I think that, tunnel vision is a real thing that sets in, Dr. Phil, when you are in, the position of prosecuting somebody, of telling a story about what it is they did. I think it can be real easy for that tunnel vision to set in, and make no mistake, right? I mean, all of us are vulnerable to that. All of us get wedded to our own narratives. There's no question about that. And that's why I think this partnership that Dave and I have forged has been so incredibly valuable, because we can serve as checks on each other. We can bounce ideas off each other. Am I getting too much, in my own place of tunnel vision here, right? So those are the conversations we have all the time that are so useful as we think about moving forward.
Right. And you mentioned, Dr. Phil, the prosecutor perspective here. And I think it's important to see how that trickles down to the detective, right? I like what you said, their goal is to seek justice, not a conviction. And when we look at the interview or the interrogation, the goal should be, how do I obtain actionable intelligence versus a confession? And it's that mindset shift of, let's get rid of this presumption of guilt. And instead, let's enter a conversation with the goal of, let me obtain as much information as possible so that we can further investigate. But, we've got this kind of CSI Law and Order effect where everybody thinks the goal of every conversation is to get the I did it. And in fact, that promotes the tunnel vision that Laura just spoke about.
I work with law enforcement as well, doing training and all, and I've been asked over the years so many times, is Stephen Avery guilty and is Brendan Dassey guilty? I've given the same answer every time, and that is, all I can tell you for sure is that neither one has ever had a fair trial. Don't know if they did or didn't. I can tell you what I think. What I know is they've never had a fair trial.
Well, look, I can speak only as Brendan's lawyer, but I've represented Brendan Dassey for 15 years now. And my work on his case and getting to know this young man who was 17 when I met him, he is 33 years old now. I am so proud to represent Brendan Dassey. The only evidence connecting him to this murder is this confession we're talking about, where he's not even able to describe what happened. I mean, every citizen who cares about truth, who cares about due process, who cares about reliability in our criminal justice system should be jumping off their couches and, rushing out there to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Not to Brendan, not to any other special education student, not to any other kid, not to any of us, right? The way the system let that boy, now man, down is just heartbreaking.
Laura provided the opportunity for us a few weeks ago to chat with Brendan. And I think it's important for me to be able to say how kind and inspiring Brendan Dassey is. And I can't imagine anybody I've talked to. I know we had Terrell Swift on your show. Anybody I've talked to that's been kind of a victim of this process, it just amazes me the hope and the positivity and the focus that they have because they know who they are and they know what they did or did not do. And just Brendan's just one of the positive, most inspirational piece of this whole puzzle, I think.
Yeah, he's 33, as I said, and Brendan I've watched him grow up, and he's grown up into this unbelievably kind, gentle, funny person who still has this childlike faith that one day justice is going to come for him. it's remarkable. After making a murderer, all these people around the globe, millions and millions of people saw his story. They started writing Brendan letters, right? From all over the globe. You'd get these letters. He still gets like 5 or 10 letters every day.
Really?
From ordinary people who just, it's nothing profound or eloquent, who just put down on a piece of paper, hey, Brendan, hang in there. I'm thinking of you. I believe in you. Hold your head up high. The truth is going to come out. This kind of stuff. He still gets these letters every day. He keeps them. And he writes back to as many people as he can, given his limitations. He writes back to as many people as he can because those letters, finding their way to his prison cell in rural Wisconsin, some from Australia, some from, the other side of the country, some from just down the street in Wisconsin. Those letters give him an enormous amount of hope.
So what is the solution? A lot of what is being done, I think it's generous to say that it's confirmation bias. I think it's generous to say that it's tunnel vision. I think that there's just a lot of, I don't care. I've got somebody in the box here and my job's to get a conviction. I'm going to get a conviction. I've worked with so many of these prosecutors who have just told me straight up, I came over here, A, to get experience in front of a jury, and B, to build up a one-loss record, hopefully perfect, and then I'm going to jump to the defense side of the docket so I can then start recruiting these cases and say, hey, I was a prosecutor. I was your worst nightmare. I never lost a case. I know how to beat these cases because I've been on the other side. I think they've got an agenda. Some of these guys have an agenda, and then they're going to jump to the other side of the docket and try to get rich off of it. I think there's more larceny in their hearts than just simple confirmation bias. But what do we do? How do we fix this? What does the legislation need to call for?
Well, I can speak to the law enforcement piece of this. There's a slide I have in our PowerPoint that says if it ain't broke, break it. And part of the first thing that we have to do when we're training investigators is identify they've used techniques for the last several decades that in their mind have been successful because they have successfully solved some cases. And so the first thing we have to do is educate what all of these potential tactics are that can be a problem. The second thing we have to do in conjunction with that is provide education on what training does work. About almost a year ago now, my hometown of Buffalo, New York, we had a shooting, a racist attack at a grocery store. Sentencing was just about a week ago. We had 10 people in our community were killed. And if you have to go interview the witnesses to a shooting, you can't be relying on these deceptive tactics or assuming how they're going to respond. You need to understand how trauma impacts those witnesses. And the same thing applies in all of these cases, is providing a tool for investigators to go get information. From a legislative piece, the last third piece of this remedy is making sure not only policy and a department reflects new training, making sure that's bought in from the command staff top down, making sure the prosecutor's office knows what a reliable confession looks like. And if all that doesn't work, and it hasn't, we have to know that about 30% of wrongful convictions contained a false confession, which means about 30% of these had confessions that were admitted by the courts as voluntary. And so the important piece of legislation is to provide the courts a screening tool to identify if all else fails, this shouldn't be used as evidence in a conviction against a potentially innocent person. So I think those are at least the three prongs that we're working on this side.
I just throw one other thing into the mix here that I think another thing that surprises people, ordinary people, is the idea of prosecutorial immunity and police immunity. For those of us who are just, doing our jobs, living our lives, you make a big mistake at your job, or if you do something intentionally wrong at your job, all of us can be held liable. People can sue us, right? I can get sued as a lawyer for malpractice. We can all get sued in different ways, held accountable for the things that we do wrong. But what's wild is that for police and prosecutors, it's not the same, right? They have been carved out of that system and given special immunity so that if you are a prosecutor, and let's say you are a bad guy, and you decide to intentionally frame someone for murder, knowing that they're innocent, right? The worst of the worst of the worst things you can do. Send them away to prison for life or maybe to death row. And you do this on purpose. You cannot be held liable. under the law because of immunity, right? And police officers have qualified immunity that act to protect them, even if they do things intentionally wrong. And I think that's a huge part of the system that's got to be fixed too. We can all be held accountable to each other. And there's no reason to take a couple of groups of professions, police, prosecutors, and treat them different than doctors or teachers or, other important people with important responsibilities in our society.
So many of these people that are the detectives, the investigators, are out there really trying to figure out what really happened. And the bad thing is, when you get a false confession and you convict the wrong person, that means the wrongdoer is still out on the street.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, you asked for advice for maybe parents or listeners, but the law enforcement folks that are listening, or those that have a phone and want to call and see how their department's training. When you look at investigators right now, most departments, maybe annually or biannually, they have to get qualified on how to shoot a weapon, how to fire a weapon. They have to get trained and certified on use of force, on a taser, on how to drive their vehicle. But for interview and interrogation, which is we're talking about this whole session here and how powerful that is, it's often go to a 2 or 3 day class or learn on the job, and one class for 20-year career, you're good. And what we need is more required mandated education and accountability when people aren't compliant with it, just like every other task that they have on the job. And because we're now seeing how powerful these tools are when they're used improperly.
Yeah, people don't know the psychological subtleties of this and what's going on. We know psychologically, if you can keep somebody from making a denial, if they start to make a denial and you can stop them short, even if you just jump in and say their name, if they start to say, I didn't, Dave, let me ask you something else. If you can just stop them, they're a lot more likely to ultimately confess if you don't let them dig a hole and they have a face-saving way out. There are so many subtleties that people don't understand, and if they're using all of those things to back somebody into a corner, if you're a civilian, you can't know what all is going on in there. You need to have a lawyer, and you need to zip it. You never have to talk to them, ever, correct? If you are charged with a crime, you never have to give an interview or a statement.
Correct. That's exactly right. You never need to, and you should not do it. Instead, you ask for that lawyer.
Yeah.